Yeah, recording sound.
Right, welcome everybody to this first of a number of regular talks that Philip is planning to give to us over the year and years ahead, I hope. And this particular talk is going to be in several parts because there's so much information to give you. And there probably another meeting in May. We'll give you the exact date soon. Um, and I wanted to just say that this will be recorded and available on the AA YouTube site. And it's a very scholarly kind of thing that is uniquely available in many ways. There's not many people who could put this together. So we're going to gradually build up this scholarly collection of information which people can look at all over the world. And I do encourage everybody to tell people about the International Astrology Library. I'm going to put in the chat box the link to the YouTube channel, the link to the International Library on the AA website. And also, if you really want to I'm not sure how many of these books are available in the library. I suspect a lot of them, and some of them will be available on the inline library, which Philip will tell you about. And you can subscribe to that. And by subscribing, you encourage us to include more and more information. And obviously, you can also donate to this project because what we want to do is we've got thousands and thousands of astrology books, and we want more and more of them to be available to more and more people all over the world. It's a very worthy project. That's just general statement. I'd like to now pass over the rest of the evening to Mary English, who's going to introduce Philip and look after the chat and interactions, and Philip himself. Thank you very much, Mary.
Thanks, Roy. I'm just about to introduce Philip to you. So, Philip is an independent scholar of the history of astrology and a dedicated astrology librarian. He has previously lectured on historical astrological topics for a number of international conferences, including the Organization for Professional Astrology. His essays have been published in the Mountain Astrologer and the Astrological Journal. He maintains the Astrological Association's International Astrology Library, the online version of it as well, and is now combined with the Philip Graves Library, containing tens of thousands of books and periodicals at his base in Newport in Wales. Philip's website, AstroLearn Astrology, is available as well. So thank you very much to Philip, if you'd like to put your hands together to welcome him this evening.
Thank you very much, Mary and Roy, for that introduction. And we're going to go, and thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate it. And I hope we're going to find this of interest. As it was announced, it's the first of a series of talks. And today we're just going to cover a literature survey and 15 early sources in detail. And we will be edging towards modern psychological astrology, but not quite getting there yet today. Let's in terms of the actual extent of psychological material, but there are early progenitors to psychological astrology, and that is precisely what I wanted to explore in this series of talks. So I'm going to share my screen now, and in a moment I will just have to start the slideshow. And please let me know if that is working for everybody. That's the title screen before we continue.
Yep, that's all fine.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. So as you can see from the screen, this first lecture will start with a literature survey analysing the prevalence of psychological keywords within titles in the Western astrological literature of 3 major European languages. And then part 2 is going to be called Psychological Astrology Before World War I, an examination of 15 primary sources from 1863 to 1913. No, that is where we start. So I'm going to give you an introduction first before we go to the literature survey. It is a generally accepted observation that modern Western natal astrology has tended, especially since the 20th century, to concern itself more, although not exclusively, with the reading of the inner mental or spiritual life, whereas historically practiced forms of Western natal astrology have been much more concerned with the reading of personal destiny or fate and of objectively verifiable markers of a person's life, such as physical appearance, health and sickness, assets, family, marriage, public reputation, and travel habits. In 21st century astrological culture, this distinction tends to be etched out as a clash between mutually incompatible astrological philosophies whose respective advocates fundamentally disagree on the nature of reality and the value of astrology, with, on the one hand, modern psychological astrologers being solely concerned with the reading of personality while avoiding all specific predictions, to the point of being charged by their critics with vagueness and with reliance on the Barnum effect for the seeming accuracy of generic descriptions, and on the other hand, traditional astrologers being chiefly concerned with the reading of fate and readily embracing concrete predictions, to the point of being charged by their critics with unwarranted and even unethical fatalism. A truer view of both traditional and modern astrology would be a more nuanced one, in which traditional astrology contains elements of character reading and modern astrology contains elements of prediction. But the concept of psychological astrology in itself is a relatively recent one that entered the discourse of astrology as a label for a particular type of astrological approach or philosophy only partway through the 20th century. It is my first aim in this talk to demonstrate that the relatively recent introduction and subsequent widespread adoption of the terminology of psychological astrology did not mark the beginning of the modern trend towards reading the birth chart more psychologically. Before the word psychology was adopted, the astrology of the mind was discussed and expressed in different language. For example, Alan Leo preferred to use the term esoteric astrology to refer to the inner life and motives of the individual as indicated by the birth chart. He used this term in distinction from exoteric astrology, which he used to refer to externally verifiable facts. Many other early modern writers referred to character, as we shall explore in more detail later, and it is also common, even in much older traditional astrological texts, to find references to markers of temperament and of the mind, which are inherently psychological attributes. The second aim of this series of talks is to challenge received historical narratives among English-speaking astrologers in particular around the origins of modern psychological astrology, narratives that tend to pin it on a very small number of famous innovative thinkers and writers, chiefly Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung and the astrologers Dane Ridjar and Liz Green. While the roles of all three of these thinkers avowedly have been and continue to be extremely important in the development, popularization, and enduring appeal of modern psychological astrology, it is my intellectual contention that their individual and combined teachings and writings have formed part of a much wider wave of changed human thought impacting the modern theory and practice of astrology. This is to say, firstly, that the development and publication of their respective doctrines have coincided with the moves of lesser celebrated but equally studious and earnest contemporaries in the direction of psychological exploration as part of much the same collective intellectual wave. And secondly, that the wave of which these works have all formed a part was substantially set in motion by earlier intellectual progenitors and trends in broadly the same direction, and did not spontaneously arise by chance or as a result of any one of these modern thinkers singularly leading the others. So we move to part one, literature survey, research methodology. Dane Ridjar's book, The Astrology of Personality, was first published in 1936 and is rightfully regarded as a landmark work in 20th century astrology on account of its influential attempts to integrate some of the ideas of modern psychologists, chiefly but not limited to Carl Jung, into astrologers' approach to reading the birth chart. We shall review this book and its impact closely in the third in this series of lectures. But did psychological astrology begin suddenly out of nowhere in 1936 when this book was published? No, it did not. And was Rudyard's work alone in the field for the next 40 years before Liz Green eagerly took up the cause with her book Saturn in 1976? No, it was far from alone. To address these simplistic historical narratives head-on, in August 2024, I carried out a field survey of the Proven astrological literature held within my extensive library, which had been collected as comprehensively as possible based on the existence and availability of astrological works on the new and second-hand marketplaces over a period of 3 decades, without preference for one time period over another, for famous works over lesser-known ones, or for works in English over works in the 2 major European languages that spawned the next greatest volumes of new astrological literature in the 20th century, which is to say German and French, thus making it a reasonably neutral field, and one with the practical research advantage over theoretical book lists that every book within it could readily be inspected to determine the true nature of its ideas. The purpose of this field survey was to try to establish when different terms indicative of a psychological approach to astrology first occurred in book titles, and to identify all instances of their doing so up to the year 1960. Why 1960, you may well ask? Well, it is an arbitrary end date to some degree, and a cut-off point was needed to contain the size and scope of the literature review. But my specific aim with this date was to categorically exclude all astrological literature that was influenced by the New Age counterculture movement that rose to prominence during the 1960s and spearheaded a huge new wave of astrological literature, partly, although not exclusively, in its image, starting around 1968. The literature of psychological astrology published no later than 1960 is demonstrably of an earlier generation than the literature of psychological and soul-centered astrology published from the late 1960s onwards, and tends to be informed by a narrower range of cultural influences. This survey was carried out in 2 initial phases, with a third belatedly added on for the purposes of preparing this talk. In the first phase, I stuck rigidly to the word psychology, its derivatives such as psychological and psychoanalyzing, and their equivalents in French and German, while also allowing the French term typocosmie, one that was directly derived from modern psychological theory and that implicitly connects the cosmos to the classification of humanity into distinct psychological types, as well as its German equivalent, typokosmia. In the second
Philip, I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second. Are we still on the first slide? Has been a
Yes, we are,
question.
because I haven't got to the results yet, but they're coming up.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry to interrupt.
It's fine. In the second phase, I broadened the linguistic parameters to encompass the term character and its direct equivalents in French and German. Although I also initially looked for texts containing the term personality, it quickly became apparent that Rudyard's book using this term in its title was highly unusual on this account, as there was little evidence of its use in book titles by other authors before, during, or even considerably after the first half of the 20th century. In the third phase, I looked exclusively for the occurrence of terms derived from the word esoteric and its direct equivalents in French and German, to see how their use could inform the developing trend towards modern psychological astrology, while acknowledging that they may not all be relevant, as some writers have used references to esotericism more to signpost mystically derived forms of spiritual doctrine. In all phases of this research, each separately published work was counted only once for each language in which an edition of it appeared, and then for the earliest edition held or recorded in the credits as having been previously published, irrespective of whether or not multiple editions were held, to ensure that no one title received undue weighting compared with any other. Multi-volume works comprising 12 separate booklets, one for each of the zodiac signs, were treated as a single work. However, multi-volume works whose component volumes covered different theoretical or astrological ground, building on each other's foundations, and appeared in separate years, were counted once for each distinct volume published. The full title as printed was considered, and all volumes within a particular series of French books using the collective author or publisher name, Section psychologique du Centre International d'Astrologie, were treated as qualifying for inclusion owing to the implicit psychological astrology approach of all the books in the series, irrespective of their individual titles. Now let us examine the results. Phase 1, searching only for the words psychology and psychoanalysis, their direct derivatives, and their French and German equivalents, although also allowing for the French term typocosmie, uncovered the following numbers of qualifying books in each language. To distinguish the prevalence of these keywords in the pre-Rudyard era and their prevalence within the first 25 years of the Rudyard era, I have in all cases broken down the totals into the number of books first published up to and including the year 1935 before the comma, and the number first published from 1936 to 1960 after the comma. So we have English 14, of which 4 before and 10 after. French 21, of which 5 before and 16 after. And German also 21, of which 5 before and 16 after. From the results of the first phase of our survey, we can see that in all three linguistic astrological cultures surveyed, there were considerably more distinct books containing words meaning psychology or typocosmie from 1936 to 1960 than there were prior to 1936. But equally, we can see that in all three languages, there were some matching titles prior to 1936. 4 in English, 5 in French, and 5 in German, which shows that consciousness of the language of psychology had permeated astrologers writing in all three languages prior to the appearance of Dane Rudyard's book, The Astrology of Personality, in 1936. The earliest dates found for books matching these keyword searches in the respective languages were 1908 in French, 1922 in English, and 1927 in German, in all cases substantially predating not only the publication of Rudyard's book, but also the very launch in 1933 of the magazine American Astrology, in which his articles towards it first appeared. This timeline already incontrovertibly demonstrates that Rudyard, while he was a major influence on the development and later uptake by English-speaking astrologers of modern psychological astrology, did not initiate the trend towards its adoption by astrologers. The truth of the matter is rather that he provided one of its most thoughtful and intellectually cogent contributions after interest had already been awakened in this direction among astrologers in multiple linguistic cultures. A further finding from this first phase of research is that there were significantly fewer new astrological books referencing either psychology or typocosmie in their titles published in English from 1936 to 1960 than there were such books published in either French or German during that 25-year period, with 11 distinct English language volumes of relevance, including Rudyard's famous book, found during the years 1936 to 1960, compared with 16 in each of French and German. This suggests that despite Jungian psychological astrology having latterly become extremely popular in English-speaking astrological cultures since 1976, when Liz Green's first book, Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil, was first published, the publication of The Astrology of Personality in 1936 did not unleash a significant wave of books on psychological astrology in English in its immediate aftermath, or indeed for decades to follow, whereas the parallel development of and writing upon psychological astrology by French-speaking and German-speaking astrologers was significantly more intensive over this 25-year period. This in itself disproves any notion that Rudyard's book, The Astrology of Personality, singularly spearheaded the development of modern psychological astrology, and shows that it would have continued to be developed by French-speaking and German-speaking astrologers, irrespective of the appearance or otherwise of his book at that point in time, even if it proved a major long-term influence upon interest in psychological astrology among English-speaking astrologers. Now we shall move on to phase 2 of this research, in which I search for the word character and its French and German equivalents. English, 26, of which 22 before 1936, 4 after. French, 3, of which 1 before and 2 after. German 24, of which 11 before 1936 and 13 after. From the results of this phase of the survey, we can see that whereas far more English language books containing the word psychology or its derivatives in their titles were published from 1936 onwards than prior to 1936, the reverse scenario applies to words derived from character, which proliferated more in the titles of astrology books first published before 1936 than in those first published from 1936 to 1960, as shown by the 23 examples found from 1842 to the early 1930s, compared with only 4 from 1936 to 1945 and none at all from 1946 to 1960. This trend, mirroring in reverse the one already established for words derived from psychology, raises the intriguing question of to what degree the use of the language of psychology simply replaced that of character in English language astrological book titles from the mid-20th century onwards, while essentially alluding to much the same concerns. It is also of note that the focus on character in English language astrological book titles first appears in the mid-19th century, 34 years before Carl Jung was even born in 1875, and that there are 2 such examples before his birth, albeit both from the pen of the same author, Zadkiel, whose real name was Richard Morrison. Yet we do not need to wait for Jung to begin publishing on psychology to find examples by other prominent 19th century astrologers. We don't even need to wait for him to have grown up. The cited books by Raphael VI, Robert T. Cross, and Hiram Erastus Butler were published in 1877 and 1887 respectively, when Jung was but a small child. This already testifies to an increased focus on character delineation within the titles of English language astrology books before Jung had even reached his teens, let alone become an eminent psychologist, and strongly suggests that astrologers were already increasing their headline focus on the delineation of character from the birth chart in their astrological textbooks published in the late 19th century, entirely independently of not only Rudyard but also Jung, and even incidentally Alan Leo, whose very first astrology book would not appear before 1896 and does not contain any matching keywords in its title. When we move into the first 2 decades of the 20th century, there is a further increased concentration of astrology books in English referencing character in their titles, with 8 distinct works meeting this criterion in the library dating from the 1900s and a further 5 from the 1910s. During these decades, Jung's first works on psychology were published in German, but this seems on analysis to be an acausal temporal coincidence with, rather than a cause of, the increased number of English language astrological works referencing character in their titles during this period, as part of the heightened wave of interest in exploring human psychology that was simultaneously affecting astrologers and the development of psychological theory itself by psychologists. 2 key works authored by Jung that would later influence psychological astrologers were published in the original German in the first quarter of the 20th century. Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, 1912, which was translated into English as Psychology of the Unconscious and first published thus in 1916, and Psychologische Typen, which was published in 1921 in German, 2 years before the English translation first appeared as Psychological Types in 1923. When we appreciate that most English-speaking writers on astrology did not even read German, the dates of the first publications of these works in English are more relevant to our examination of the degree to which Jung may or may not have influenced English-speaking astrologers at this relatively early stage in the development of his international reputation as a psychological theorist. Collectively, we can see that no fewer than 16 distinct English language astrological works referencing character in their titles appeared before 1916, thus independently of any influence by Jung, and a total of 17 before 1923, when the English translation of Psychological Types was first published. Additionally, we have seen from the results of the first phase of our survey that the first English language book specifically referencing psychology in its title, appeared in 1922, a year before this book, which demonstrates that some English-speaking astrologers were integrating the language of psychology into their astrological worldviews before Jung's work differentiating psychological types was even available in English. When we further consider that the first French language astrology book referencing psychology in its title was published in 1908, several years before either of these key works by Jung was published even in the original German, are allusions received from history books and other teachings that have sought to place him as the original inspiration behind the development of Western psychological astrology ought rightfully to be fully shattered. The evidence from the timeline of publications leaves no doubt that psychological astrology was under development before Jung, and we can confidently declare that it would have continued to be developed without him in one way or another, even if he had never published any writings on psychology. Although I think we can all agree that it would have been significantly impoverished on a qualitative level without his body of work that has significantly informed and inspired so much of its later development. Looking next at the Phase 2 results for French language and German language books, we find a less compelling contrast in the respective timelines for those with those for terms meaning psychology in the same languages than we found for English language works. The results for French were so few altogether that their timeline relative to 1936 is arguably of no clear statistical significance, since we found just one book referencing caractère before 1936 and two after. The results for German are much more extensive but evenly balanced in terms of time before or after Rudyard's famous book, with 11 works referencing character and its derivatives before 1936 and 13 qualifying volumes from 1936 to the 1950s. The earliest German astrology book found with character in its title is from 1913, which is 14 years before the earliest German one found referencing Psychologia in its title. 1913 is again well before Jung's first works that would later influence the development of modern psychological astrology appeared in the original German, which shows that the focus on character in German language astrology books predates Jung's impact upon astrological literature even in Germany. It is worth adding here for historical context that the absence of any German language books referencing character in their titles prior to 1913, in contrast to the considerable number of English language works that did so from 1842 onwards, does not strongly signify that German-speaking astrologers became attuned to this type of astrological focus only after 1910. Rather, it reflects the extreme paucity of astrological books of any kind being published in German prior to 1910, since Germany experienced a relatively late revival in astrological publishing, one that began to gather significant momentum only from 1910 onwards. On the other hand, the lack of references to caractère in the titles of French language astrology books prior to the 1930s is more complex to account for, because there were numerous new French astrology books published from the 1880s to the 1920s, but they tended to appear with more concise titles than the extended ones seen on many German and English language books of the period. Some of those earlier French books were strongly rooted in astrological tradition in any case, but those that did look more specifically at personality from the 1900s onwards seem to have moved directly to using the word psychologie. Here finally are the results for the belatedly constructed Phase 3, in which I searched only for the word esoteric and its derivatives in French and German language equivalents. Sorry, its derivatives and French and German language equivalents. English, 11, of which 9 before and 2 after 1936. French, 7, 1 before, 2 after 1936. And German, 7, of which 3 before and 1 after 1936. These results merit analysing with more caution and circumspection than those of the previous two phases of the survey, precisely because of the varied applications of the word esoteric in relation to astrology. For some astrologers, it has evoked a philosophical alignment in approach with mysticism and related doctrines, such as those taught by Helena Petrona Blavatsky within the extensive pages of her multi-volume works Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. In some cases, esotericists have gone so far as to claim to have received channeled wisdom via automatic writing. But for Alan Leo, references to esoteric astrology were not an appeal to mystical doctrine so much as one to the inner spiritual component of human nature and the motive cause behind human behavior, thus giving his vision of esoteric astrology common ground with the study of psychology, albeit as processed more through the esoteric teachings that Leo had absorbed from theosophy and other sources than through the works of any academic psychologists. In looking at the English language results, we find 9 books published before 1936, of which 5 were either authored or overseen by Alan Leo himself, and just 2 books from 1936 onwards, of which one by C.C. Zane, also known as Albert Benjamin, right upon the threshold, and the other by Alice Bailey considerably later. The weighting of the results is strikingly similar to that we have seen earlier in the English language results for the word character, in that references to esoteric are much more frequent in astrological book titles in English before 1936 than they are in those from 1936 to 1960, although unlike in the case of character, none at all is found prior to 1900. There is instead a concentration from the 1900s to the 1930s. Before we rush to conclude that Leo is solely responsible for the seemingly short-lived popularity of the use of the term esoteric in English language astrological book titles, we must also once again factor in Hiram Butler and his 1887 book Solar Biology, which, although it did not reference esotericism in its title, was published by the Esoteric Publishing Company, this having been the publishing arm of Butler's very own organization, the Esoteric Fraternity, which was heavily influenced in its inception by his studies with the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, an initiatic occult order created in 1870. Butler's work in turn demonstrably influenced Leo. We shall look in more detail at Butler's book and its influence on modern astrology soon. The French language results for the term ésotérique, in marked contrast, comprise only 1 book published before 1936, this being a direct French translation of Leo's first book to use the term esoteric in its title. The others are all considerably later, ranging in date from 1936 to 1953, which is suggestive of a growth of interest in esoteric doctrine among active French astrological writers from the 1930s onwards. That these French language originals are all so much later than the earliest French works to use the term psychologie in their titles suggests that in French usage, ésotérique was emphatically not a primitive expression equivalent in meaning to psychologique, and was instead tied much more to mystical doctrines and lore traditionally found outside the domain of astrology itself. We see a fairly similar pattern with the German language results for esoterisch and its derivatives, with no relevant book published before 1930 found to contain any such word in its title, but then 5 in the 1930s by 3 different authors, one in the late 1940s, and a decidedly mystical sounding one more on the fringes of astrology in the late 1950s. As the words meaning both psychology and character had already found their ways into German book titles well before 1930, this again suggests a distinct and more mystical or occult meaning attached to esoterisch in the German astrological context. However, one of the most influential German astrological and esoteric writers of the 1920s, Oscar A. H. Schmitz, entitled his highly successful off-reprinted 1922 work Der Geist der Astrologie, which translates as the spirit of astrology, evoking a similar approach to that of Alan Leo in looking at the inner spiritual workings of astrology. Yet the second internal book of Der Geist is headed Astropsychologia, and Schmitz had personal acquaintance with Jung. His overall choice of title, or rather his choice of overall title, considered together with his title for the second internal book, testifies to a fluid exchange between the language of spirit and that of psychology in 1922 in Germany. We shall look at his book more closely in the second lecture. Perhaps ultimately, even in Alan Leo's case, appeal to esoteric astrology evinces a preference for spiritual doctrine as a source for understanding inner psychology through the lens of astrology, as opposed to taking a lead from modern scientific theories of psychology. But in practice, Leo's work very much formed part of a wave of English language astrological books appearing around the turn of the 20th century that gave significantly more attention to character and inner motives in birth chart analysis than previous generations of astrology books had done. The inherent theosophical and other esoteric influences upon Leo's work in this direction certainly may have exceeded the equivalent influences in astrology books of the time period by other authors that referenced only character in their titles, but the result in terms of a greater emphasis on character reading than in traditional astrological textbooks was broadly comparable, despite the lack of direct or overt influence from any school of modern psychology. With or without the theosophical input, this emerging trend in natal astrology was happening alongside the growth of modern psychology from a common cause of enhanced social interest in reading and understanding human character, rather than being directly led by the growth of formal academic psychology at this early stage. It may further be argued that this trend was not confined to astrology or psychology, and that the same cause had been manifest in the growth of books on character reading from physiognomy since the late 18th century, and from both palmistry and phrenology since the mid 19th century. Academic psychology was merely the more intellectually respectable domain in which this growing search for inner understanding took root, but it was not the progenitor of the trend so much as being one of several offshoots of it that grew in parallel with each other long before it began to manifestly influence or hold decisive sway over the others. And that is the end of part one. And I think we should take a pause here for questions. So I'm going to temporarily stop sharing my screen. And are there any questions on the research results before we go to part two?
Charlotte, can we unmute Charlotte so she can ask her question, please?
Charlotte can unmute
Yeah.
herself.
Okay.
It's a rather it's a rather silly question, Philip. I've noticed a title by Tierens, who is of course a Dutch astrologer, but the book you have there was translated at that time in English.
Correct. Yes,
Oh,
yes, I'm well
great.
aware of that. The original was, I think, in 1911, but it wasn't, or perhaps 1913, but it wasn't translated into English for another 20 years. So,
Mm.
um, one limitation of this study, obviously, is that because I focused on three major European languages, I haven't got Dutch books in the original language. So that would require a later additional phase of research to integrate those. And I do think it's well worth doing in the future.
Oh, I sense collaboration in our future, Philip.
That would be good. I look forward to that, Charlotte. Any other questions before we move on to the individual examination of sources?
We've got a comment so far saying very thorough and well done. That's from Christina Montana.
Thank you,
Oh, sorry,
Christina. That's much
Mozart.
appreciated.
Sorry, wrong pronunciation of surname.
Mary, if I'd want to chat it up, I'm just thinking when you were talking, this is so thorough, but maybe you're relying very much on the title, Philip.
Hmm.
To what extent do you think that maybe miss some of the content that is more psychological?
Definitely, that's a very valid comment, Roy. I had to limit the numbers of sources in some ways, so I did filter by titles just to give an overview in the first place of what the important focus of these books was, or according to the writers who wrote them. And I think that is largely reflected in the title, even though there are exceptions, as for example, with the book by Oskar Schmitz, where the second internal book is called Astropsychologia, but the overall title is just Der Geist der Astrologie, which doesn't necessarily tell you that it's going to have a major section on psychology in it. So that's a very valid point. And inevitably, the source we're going to sample will not explore the psychological content in books that don't reference psychology, character, or esotericism in their titles, but we have to limit it in some way. So I would very much suggest that this is a preliminary exploration of the history, the early history of psychological astrology, and that the gaps can later be filled in by looking at books that do not mention psychology, character, or esotericism in their title that were published in this period. But there are so many of them that that would take a very, very long time to study them
Telling me.
all.
I'm just thinking of Ebertein's combination of stellar influences, for example, which is, it doesn't only talk about psychology, but it's got a psychological analysis of pretty well every midpoint you can imagine. It's
Yeah.
certainly, and it is not necessarily, do you think that's influenced by Jung at all, or do you think it's his own ideas? And
I
his,
haven't got to that period in my research yet, but just to put it in context, Everton's book you mentioned, that was first serialized, actually, well, it was around 1940 to 1941, just before Everton was arrested by the German authorities who were clamping down on astrology. I think he was arrested in
mm,
May 1941 and all his books were confiscated. But just in the year before then, he had issued this primitive edition of Kombination der Gestirne in Flüsse, which is the original German title for that book, in the form of cards. And it was a set of cards printed on both sides. And very, very few of them were released before his books were confiscated. Fortunately, two of his subscribers had bought copies and managed them to hide them from the Nazi authorities throughout the Second World War, and he was therefore able to reprint um, in book form after 1947. But I do think that yes, all Everton's material is worth looking at in detail later for the post-Rudyard period. However, I don't think that particular book is going to be prominent in my survey of the period after 1936, simply because it doesn't include psychology or character in its title, whereas some of Everton's work did. And I think in the list for German publications from 1936, 1960, there was at least one which used Charakter in its title. So that one will come up for sure. But no, you're absolutely right. A lot of the interpretation of midpoints leans on psychological manifestations.
We have another comment
yeah,
in
thank
the
you.
chat by Hilary. She says, "I'm loving this. As a retired academic, I appreciate your presentation, reading a paper that's so erudite and well researched."
Thank you
Mm,
very much, Hilary. That's very much appreciated.
mm.
And I hope you have a wonderfully engaging retirement and continue to enjoy studies, which as I'm sure you will, of whatever things you're interested in. Any more questions, or shall we proceed to part two?
Go for it.
She
Okay,
said her retirement is becoming an astrologer.
wonderful. That's excellent.
Do astrologers ever retire? That would be my question. I haven't yet.
Thank you, Vanessa, also for the kind comment. Okay, I'm going to go back to screen sharing then, and we will proceed with part two as soon as I can get the. Is that now showing my screen in the place it was left off?
Yeah, we're on phase 3 esoteric French.
Good, perfect. So we will now go to the start screen for part two. Is that showing in whole?
Yep, all there. Super,
Good,
thank you.
excellent. Right. Okay. So part two, psychological astrology before World War One, an examination of 15 primary sources from 1863 to 1913. We shall now take a closer look in chronological order at a selection of the sources that came up in these searches as having been published no later than 1913 and analyse their content and relevance to the roots of psychological astrology. Number 1, Zadkiel Taotse, the Handbook of Astrology containing the doctrine of nativities in a form free of all mystery, by which every man may calculate his own nativity and learn his own natural character and proper destiny, Volume 2, 1863. This was the swan song work on natal astrology by the original Zadkiel, Richard Morrison, whose first book, The Grammar of Astrology, appeared in 1833. It largely conforms to traditional astrological principles, but Morrison emphasizes the importance of reading character as part of a natal delineation, writing in his preface, page XI, the next point will be to study the mental character by noting the positions, power, and aspects of the Moon and Mercury, not forgetting to consider those planets which may be rising, especially if just above the ascendant. In chapter 4, The Quality of the Mind, Morrison elaborates, the rational and intellectual qualities are judged by Mercury, while the sensitive faculties and all animal feelings independent of reason depend on the Moon and the ascendant. This is very much a traditional methodology and is demonstrated only by a single case study. But Zadkiel's words in 1863 do show that the astrological delineation of the qualities of the mind was an important one for astrologers long before the development of modern psychological astrology. Source 2 is by Raphael, the astrologer of the 19th century. The Guide to Astrology contained the complete rudimental part of genethalical astrology, by which every person may calculate their own nativity and learn their own natural character and proper destiny, with rules and information never before published, Volume 1, 1877. This was the first edition of the first of several astrological books authored by Raphael VI, Robert T. Cross. The second author found to have included the word character in the extended title of a book on natal astrology. Like Zadkiel before him, he uses the exact expression in his title, Own Natural Character and Proper Destiny, and devotes a single short chapter, chapter 22, to the reading of The Quality of the Mind. But he goes much further than Zadkiel in alluding to the numerous astrological factors to be considered in this, pages 61 to 2, including have regard to the sign ascending, and the Sun, Mercury, and the Moon principally, although all planets have some share in the formation of the mind. In the second part of our book, we have particularized the signification of the different aspects of the planets on the mental qualities. The disposition is shown by the Sun and Moon principally. Thus, R.T. Cross is advocating the reading of character not only from Mercury and the Moon, but also from the Sun, the ascendant sign, and all other planets, and even the interplanetary aspects. This oft reprinted book arguably set a blueprint for the holistic reading of qualities of the mind from the whole of the birth chart, and with far more weight placed upon the Sun and the ascendant than had traditionally been called for. And this when Carl Jung was but a 2-year-old toddler and Alan Lear was just a teenager. Source 3. Hiram Butler, Solar Biology, a scientific method of delineating character, diagnosing disease, determining mental, physical, and business qualifications, conjugal adaptability, etc., from date of birth, 1887. Not long after founding his controversial esoteric fraternity in Boston, Massachusetts, Butler had his sole major work on astrology, Solar Biology, published by its publishing arm. Unlike the previously reviewed works by major 19th century astrologers, including the word character in their titles, this book strayed so far from the principles of traditional astrology that its author sought to dissociate it from the concept of astrology altogether, proclaiming solar biology as a distinct and new doctrine. The book was edited by a close associate of Butler's called John Latham, who admits to freely including his own elucidations in the text, and the final text can therefore reasonably be said to be their joint product. In his preface, Latham argues for the reality of the influence of the Sun, Moon, and planets on human nature and character, page 5. He adds pages 6 to 7. We are in the habit of regarding the revolutions of the earth around the sun as a mere arrangement for giving the changing seasons of the year. But solar biology reveals another and highly important use, viz., that the varying positions not only produce different seasons and stages of fruitfulness, but different human types and qualities, and that corresponding effects on character also result from the changing positions of the planets. Solar biology introduces the student into the grand workshop of the solar system, not only defining character and function, but supplying the key to self-knowledge and harmonious human relatedness. In his own preface, Butler sets out the purpose and value of his system to individuals in these terms, pages 40 to... Sorry, I don't know. I think it's pages 9 to 10. I mistyped the I of the IX. There are two general causes for failure and inharmony. First, parents often educate their children in a calling for which they have no adaptability. The second cause of inharmony is misunderstanding of each other's motives. This system, when applied according to the rules given in this book, will obviate these two great evils, also many others, for by it parents will not only be enabled to understand each other's nature, but can know what care their children should have whilst young, and what their strong and weak points, both vitally and mentally, should say are, I think. In essence, he is arguing here for the study of the birth chart primarily from the standpoint of both the mind and from the standpoint both of the mind and also from that of indicators of physical health. He later, page 11, elaborates more on the value of reading the mental qualities via solar biology thus. Heads of families and individuals may also gain important insight into the peculiar characteristics of themselves and others, and thus understand the causes of the varied sensations, emotions, appetites, and passions of those with whom they have to do. What is this if not a narrative description of the study of variable individual human psychology, albeit without specific reference to the word? In Chapter 1, Preliminary Philosophy, Butler then expressly references the word psychological in the context of discussion of the qualities needed for success in business, page 18. The second ruling principle in business, the psychic power, is the force that has been conserved to the use of the brain and concentrated and sent out by the will, with a combative, subduing, or controlling intent. A man with a strong mind, having this psychological power well developed, is enabled to control those having less mental power so that he actually projects into the other's mind his own feelings, thoughts, and desires, to the suspension of the other person's power to control themselves by their own will. Considerable further general theorizing on the workings of the mind follows, leaving one in no doubt that Butler wished to contextualize the reading of the birth chart within a theory of general psychology. Yet his book was published when Jung was just 12 years old. The astrological content of the book includes unprecedentedly extensive readings of the natal sun signs spanning 32 pages at an average of 2.5 pages or well over 50 lines of text per sign, with most of each reading being mental or psychological in focus and just a small portion being related to the body and health. What follows the sun sign delineations was arguably even more revolutionary. A full set of 144 combined delineations, the natal sun and moon signs, collectively spanning 122 pages, with each combination therefore receiving on average slightly less than one whole page. The focus of the readings is again predominantly psychological, with a curious twist. At the start of most readings, Butler alludes in summary to the indication of the combination for the mindset of the parents. Given how much of 20th century psychology has been focused on the influence of parents upon the psyche, and that Butler was writing before Sigmund Freud, let alone Carl Jung, and had authored his the Butler was writing before Sigmund Freud, let alone Carl Jung, had authored his very first psychological textbook. This approach is historically striking, although it is perhaps easy to explain in terms of astrological tradition that associates the sun and moon with the parents. Regardless of the significance or otherwise of this parental focus, the precedent set by Butler in extensively delineating every natal sun and moon sign combination in 1887 was unequivocally influential, paving the way for authors of such renown as Alan Leo, Grant Louis, and even Charles and Susie Harvey to adopt this same approach in their own later works, as well as lesser known others. In Leo's case, the first of two notable instances of this would be in his second book, Astrology for All, which was serialized in the pages of Modern Astrology magazine starting in 1899 and completed in 1900. These solely lunar character portraits are one of three key features of Butler's book that demonstrably influence Alan Leo's work, whether directly or indirectly via intermediary works by third-party authors. The others being Butler's expansive delineations of the sun signs and his almost singular focus on the astrological reading of character. Leo would not even begin to emerge as an astrological writer before 1890, when he co-founded the Astrologers magazine, and he would not author a book dedicated mainly to the sun signs before 1901, when the first edition of his brief book aimed at the popular market, Everybody's Astrology, appeared. Yet several early 21st century historians have mistakenly attributed the genesis of all three of the changes set in motion by Butler's work of 1887 to Alan Leo, to the point that this seems to have become the standard received view in academia, a view that does not hold up to scrutiny in the face of the literary evidence afforded by the historical sequence of publications and Leo's demonstrable awareness of Butler's work and of multiple sun sign books before his. Over the following chapters of Butler's astrological magnum opus, the planets from Mercury to Uranus are more briefly delineated through the 12 signs, with the focus of each reading again being primarily on character and motivation, with some indications of physical health mixed in. The book Solar Biology does not teach the use of the houses, and nor does it teach any astrological forecasting methods. There is no formal teaching of the interplanetary aspects, although there are implicit references to influence from planets in whole sign conjunction with the Sun. Some reports suggest that Butler and his followers left Boston under a cloud of allegations of impropriety within years of the first publication of Solar Biology. But they relocated the esoteric fraternity to Applegate, California, where it remained in operation through almost 30 reprints of the book until at least the 1970s, testifying to its long-term marketplace success. Source 4. Eleanor Kirk, The Influence of the Zodiac Upon Human Life, with character readings of persons born upon the cusp. That edition, circa 1900 to 1905. But the original edition of Eleanor Kirk's book was published in 1894, and did not include mention of cusps or character readings in its title, although it did teach the same doctrine, arguing that for the first 5 days spent by the sun in each sign, its influence on the individual will also partake of its impact in the previous sign. And for reasons of historical accuracy, we shall refer to the 1894 first edition here. Kirk's book is historically important on two accounts. It was the first full-length natal astrology book dedicated almost solely to the reading of the 12 natal sun signs, and it was also one of the earliest printed books on astrology written by a woman, and probably the earliest by an American woman. Eleanor Kirk was in reality Eleanor Ames, a notable suffragist and campaigner for the rights of women, making it seem all the more fitting that she was the first American woman to have an astrology book published, even if she had to publish it herself. The late James Herschel Holden, within his biographical dictionary of Western astrologers, intriguingly cites veteran 19th century American astrologer Luke Dennis Brufton as having responded scathingly to Hiram Butler's solar biology doctrine, and as having bracketed Kirk's book together with that of Butler in this genre, calling them collectively pseudo-astrological works. Brufton's perception that Kirk's book was an offshoot of Butler's new system is justified both by the preliminary theoretical material echoing Butler's doctrine in abbreviated form, within Kirk's book that is, and also by the unprecedented length of her sun sign delineations and the sole focus of the rest of the book on these. In effect, Kirk goes even further than Butler in paring down solar biology to the reading chiefly of character and psychology, and secondarily of health, from the sun signs alone, each covered at exhaustive length. Between them, the 12 chapters in the book dedicated to the reading of the natal sun signs span 138 pages at an average of about 11 pages or 250 short lines of text per sign. Before we move on to our next source, we must note here that the very next year, 1895, the prolific esoteric writer W.J. Colville, a British emigre to the USA, wrote his own full-length sun sign book called Our Places in the Universal Zodiac, which has slightly more text per sun sign than Kirk's, as the lines are longer, although again his readings average about 250 lines per sign. Colville had read the recent books by Hiram Butler and Eleanor Kirk, but sought to improve on them, declaring that his book was aimed at the ever-increasing number of students of mental science and cognate themes, who ply us with questions concerning the true relation between mental science and astrology. The reference to mental science could not be clearer. The science of the mind is psychology. Colville's testimony in 1895 adds a new layer to our understanding of the development towards psychological astrology in the 1890s by showing that it was partly led by demand from students of psychology itself who also took an interest in astrology. Besides, 2 years later, Colville authored a book specifically called Old and New Psychology, 1897, testifying to his personal deep interest in the subject. From the combined cases of Eleanor Kirk and W.J. Colville, we can see that extended psychological writings on the sun signs were flourishing in the USA by the mid-1890s. Source 5, Alan Leo, 4 Lectures on Astrology, Exoteric and Esoteric, 1901. 7 years after the first edition of Eleanor Kirk's book was published in New York, the first of Alan Leo's books to include the word esoteric in its title was published in India. It was a compendium of lectures on astrology that he gave while on a tour of India. In the first lecture, he draws his distinction between exoteric and esoteric astrology in these words, page 2. That part of astrology which we call exoteric may be called fatalism, fortune-telling, or by any term you like, but the esoteric is that which reveals the inner side of the science. Leo goes on to expressly link the reading of natal astrology to modern psychology, stating, pages 3 to 4, think of the earth as representing our gross body, the 12 signs as representing our desire nature or astral body, the planets as governing the mind, and the sun the spiritual part of us. These are the 4 grand divisions. The zodiac will, all through our lives, influence our desires. The nature of our desires will be in accordance with the character of the sign that is rising at the moment of our birth. This desire nature is synonymous with what Western psychology terms the feelings. All our feelings are conditioned, accelerated or retarded by these 12 signs. It is their influence that lies behind our sensations, and in accordance with their nature, we shall feel the sensation or feeling. Those who are dominated principally or entirely by these 12 signs, apart from the influence of the planets, will be those in whom the mind is not yet fully acting apart from the lower feelings, but who are almost wholly swayed by the latter. Leo's unambivalent citation of teachings of modern Western psychology in this lecture, published in 1901, leaves no doubt that early moves by Western astrologers towards the development of a psychological astrology predate all the work of Carl Jung, whose doctoral dissertation would not be published before the following year, 1902, with all Jung's books to follow much later. Further, it is clear from the above quotation that Leo was attempting to construct a theory of astrological psychology that differentiated the collective influence of the planets from those of the signs, while integrating both elements into the picture. In essence, he has adopted the earlier cited view of Raphael VI that all elements of the birth chart influence the character, but has taken it much further, attempting to build a coherent theory of the respective workings of the elements that together compose natal astrological psychology. In the second lecture, Leo addresses the influence of the planets, characterizing them, page 24, as being like strings on the sounding board represented by the signs. He adds, pages 24 to 5, that we have, after very long practice and study, found that there are distinct types of persons who manifest the characteristic qualities ascribed to the planets. You are all familiar with the martial, the saturnine, the jovial, and other types of persons, and know their distinctive features. If you understand the influence which each planet exerts on those born under its particular dominion, as it were, you would quickly recognize the unconscious response of the masses of people to the planetary influences. There is no doubt whatsoever that Leo is here postulating a theory of psychological types linked to the planets. 20 years before Jung's book Psychologische Typen appeared in the original German, and 70 years before the Gorkeland studies into planetary temperaments. In his third lecture, Leo shows clear awareness of multiple books on the influence of the natal sun signs, having been published in the USA several years previously, which implicitly includes Eleanor Kirk's aforementioned book of 1894, and may be presumed also to include Colville's of 1895. While acknowledging the validity of these influences in practice, he takes pains to emphasize the importance of the ascendant sign, something he charges some of these American authors with having neglected to do. This is important to note because Leo has been mischaracterized by multiple authors of early 21st century books on the history of astrology as having pioneered the sun-centered approach to reading the birth chart. The evidence in his own words shows that, on the contrary, he was aware of American authors having done so before his very first book had been published, but he disagreed with their singular focus on the sun signs, seeking to moderate this by emphasizing the importance of other factors in the birth chart. Page 43. In America, about 4 or 5 years ago, some of the principal newspapers took up the subject of the sun in the sign and the character of those persons born during a particular month. And there were several books written on this subject. In the horoscopes of people, the sun and the sign it is in will govern the individual characteristics. Yet if you were to ask a person in what month he was born and gave a reading of the character from the sun in the sign, he might not recognize it as altogether accurate. Leo goes on in this lecture to explore the modifying influences of the moon, which he links to the quality of your thinking and feeling, page 50, and the planets with a particular focus on Mercury, which he calls the real mind, page 54. Within the final lecture, the moon is linked to personality, page 71, this being a consistent theme in Leo's early books. Source 6, Dr. J.R. Phelps, Our Astrological Birthday Book, Character Readings, 1903. As previously alluded to by Alan Leo, Eleanor Kirk's book was not the only one dedicated to the reading of the sun signs to emerge in the USA during the 1890s. There were others by authors such as W. J. Colville and also F.H., a fellow of the Universal Brotherhood, whose book Astrology Made Easy was published in 1898, neither of which included the word character in its respective title, but both of which perpetuated the trend towards extensive character delineation from the sun sign alone. In 1903, the growing American sun sign literature was modified by the appearance of the first of a new breed of books subdividing the readings of each sun sign into degree areas. Its author, Dr. J.R. Phelps, whose gender is unknown, would seem to have been acquainted with Eleanor Kirk's work because, like her, They theorize that the sun in the first 5 degrees of each sign partakes of some of the influence of the previous one. Only Phelps takes this theory of variability much further, arguing, page 3, that the various degrees of the same sign differ in their characteristics. For each sun sign, Phelps gives separate character readings for variable periods of between 1 and 4 days, sometimes differentiating individual dates, other times lumping them together. Theoretical and symbolic degree influence books already existed within astrology. For example, Charabel's book, The Degrees of the Zodiac Symbolized, had just recently been published in 1898, but Phelps seems to have been the first author to have elaborated variable natal character readings from the sun in different parts of each sign, and their focus is almost entirely on character and inner motivation, thus in effect psychology. Source 7, Alan Leo, How to Judge a Nativity, Part 1, The Practical Judgment of the Horoscope, as revealed by detailed consideration of the 12 houses. Part 2, The Inner Nature of Each Planet and its Special Significance in Each Sign, with some hints on the esoteric basis of astrology, 1904. This is the first and only combined edition in a single volume of 2 of Leo's 7 major natal astrological textbooks. In the following edition of 1908 to 9, Part 2 would be bound as a separate volume and substantially reworked. Within the original combined edition from 1904, it is notable at the very start of Part 2 that there is found a short chapter headed The Esoteric Basis of Astrology. Here, Leo clearly sets out, page 1, the same theoretical division of the elements of human character or psychology to which he already alluded in his 4 lectures in 1901. For instance, in linking the sun to the individuality, Mercury to mentality, and the moon to personality, while factoring in the modifying influences of the traditional malefic and benefic planets. And he further expands on his theory of esoteric astrology. The second chapter of Part 2, headed The Planetary Kaleidoscope, is also important in shedding light on Leo's integrated system of astrological psychology, since it states the type of influence on the mind of each of the planets in turn, pages 8 to 9, linking Mercury to wisdom, knowledge, and abstract thought, Venus to the refined, artistic, and pure mind, Jupiter to the philosophical, religious, and expansive mind, Saturn to the separative and critical or analytical expression of mind, Mars to the impulsive and forceful mind, Uranus to the mind not bound by code or general custom, and thus to originality and formless thought, and Neptune to the mind that is chaotic, diffusive, and weird, fanciful and uncanny, vaporous and unearthly. Source 8, M. McGregor, Astrology, the Influence of the Stars on Character and on Success in Friendship, Business, and Matrimony, 1905. The author of this book, published in Philadelphia, undertakes in their preface to reject the morbid and narrow, eliminate all sectarianism, fatality, and technicalities, and present to the public a wholesome exposition of this ancient science. In the brief Chapter 1, Astrology as a Science, McGregor decries the preposterous predictions and generally unscrupulous use of astrology, which they causally link to the subject being associated with superstition, taking inspiration from the recent advances in palmistry, especially along the line of character reading. The author proposes that astrology should similarly be focused on the reading of character, arguing that if it did so, it would be more a science and not just an art. McGregor elaborates this argument with reference to the growing esteem in which modern psychology is held, page 9. Psychology, though a mere experiment as yet, is accepted as at least the beginnings of a science. Taken together, these remarks are historically significant in anticipating that an approach to astrology akin to modern psychology would lead to greater scientific recognition for it, and this at a time when Jung was not yet of any significant public renown, with none of his major psychological works having been published even in the original German. MacGregor is a notable example of an astrologer writing soon after the turn of the 20th century who saw and expressed the value to astrology of a closer alignment with psychology long before this process was fully realized by subsequent generations of astrologers, and fully 3 decades before Rudyard wrote the component parts of the astrology of personality. MacGregor, like Kirk and Phelps, subscribes to the doctrine of sun sign cusps, allocating about the last 5 degrees of each sign and the first 5 of the next to the cusp, which would give 1/3 of all people a cusp reading. Otherwise, the astrological content of MacGregor's book quite closely follows that of Butler's, with extensive separate readings given for each sun sign, followed by much more succinct ones for each of the 144 sun and moon sign combinations, and for each of the planets in each of the signs. As in Butler's book, there is no coverage of the houses, the aspects, or astrological forecasting. Source 9, O. Hashnuhara, Psychoscopy, 1905. O. Hashnuhara has been identified by Kim Farnell, among others, as a pseudonym of Ethel Marsh Stiles. Her book, bearing the curiously contrived name of Psychoscopy, merits our attention here because the first half of its name seems to be a deliberate homophone for the word psyche, onto which the latter syllables of the word horoscopy have been appended. The book was published simultaneously in London and New York in 1905, making it an exceptionally early example of an astrology book in any language whose title even alludes to the language of psychology. Marsh Stiles does not explain her choice of name, only stating, page 9, that it is the name she has given to a new system of astrology she has developed, consisting of 3 figures said to correspond to the objective, subjective, and eternal conditions, respectively. While drawing inspiration from heliocentric principles in placing the sun in the centre, the author expressly differentiates her system from the nominally heliocentric form of astrology taught by Hiram Butler, which she notes only applies to character reading. This would seem to imply that in spite of her choosing a name suggestive of psyche, she intends for her system to extend beyond the limited focus of Butler's solar biology on character. Nonetheless, in Lesson 2, Psychoscopes, Marsh Stiles gives a stronger clue to her choice of name when she observes that it is obviously necessary to comprehend the meaning of the various planets in the various signs as applied to character and mental attributes first of all, and afterwards to the actual life influences of the native, before seeking to judge any psychoscope. In dealing with character, it is well to remember that it is really the key to actions and events. As her discussion continues, it is apparent that at variance with Butler, she sees value in astrological forecasting, although with the character first proviso in mind. For example, if you are dealing with a man who is obviously a liar and a coward, and subsequent directions indicate that he will be subjected to such and such a temptation, you can bet a pound to a gooseberry he will fall before the temptation, and the results of such a fall can easily be traced. The self-same directions would not bring a fall to a man of another temperament, for he would be strong enough to put temptation to one side. So the first step is a thorough understanding of character as indicated by the planets. This is a nuanced position, showing that Marsh Stiles, who has evidently read solar biology but also more traditional texts, has drawn learnings from Butler of the primary value of using the horoscope to assess character, in the light of which he has reassessed why and how astrological forecasting works, assessing it to be a product of transient influences acting on the natally revealed character, rather than in a fatalistic manner. She teaches the interpretation of the Moon, Mercury, and Venus in the signs and in aspect to each other planets first, which seems significant on account of traditional teachings of character primarily from the Moon and Mercury. Only in the next lesson does she teach the Sun, Mars, and Jupiter and the impact on character of their signs and aspects. Marsh Stiles plays down the importance of the houses and even of the ascendant in interpretation, emphasizing that contrary to what has been taught by astrologers, the sun is more important than the ascendant in showing the personality, pages 59 to 60. In her remarks here, she goes further than Alan Leo in her readiness to play down the importance of both the ascendant and the houses, although unlike Butler, she does consider them. Thus, her position again forges the middle ground between the revolutionary approach of Butler, who omitted to consider the ascendantal houses altogether, and the relatively mildly reformist position of Leo, who continued to use the houses in interpretation, as well as holding that being born under a sign meant being born under the ascendant, and who, in the same breath, expressed strong disagreement with the American astrologers writing in the years before him, who had been singularly focused on the sun sign in their writings. The other details of Marsh Stiles' system of natal astrological analysis are beyond the scope of this presentation, but her work as a whole represents an interesting example of contemporaneous astrologers' sometime tendencies to hybridize mutually contradictory traditional and modern technical approaches to the reading of the natal horoscope, and shows in particular that the sea change in approach unleashed on the world by Hiram Butler's solar biology reverberated far and wide and had brought character reading by astrology very much to the forefront of astrologers' considerations, but that Butler's methods were not uncritically accepted wholesale by most astrologers outside his esoteric fraternity. Source 10, Isabel M. Pagan, Astrological Key to Character, the 12 Zodiacal Types Interpreted, 1907. Isabel Pagan was a prominent Scottish theosophist who was active as an astrological writer in the early 20th century. Her first short book, Astrological Key to Character, 1907, was subsequently overhauled and vastly expanded into her major work From Pioneer to Poet or the 12 Great Gates, 1911. In her 1907 booklet, Pagan more briefly delineates the 12 signs of the zodiac while taking pains to point out, at variance with recent American writers, that her readings are focused on the signs rising, which is to say it was emphatically not intended as a sun sign book. The booklet also briefly expounds a theory of the elements that compose astrological psychology, which includes the following indications from the angles, page 13. The ascendant influences the actions and personality, the outer man. The zenith indicates the aspirations and emotions. The nadir suggests the character, and the descendant indicates the elements most likely to be lacking, and consequently points out the qualities desirable in a partner and redoubtable in an adversary. She also links the planets to specific elements of psychology and character as follows, page 17. Uranus represents the outlook or point of view. Saturn sums up character, its possibilities and limitations. Jupiter indicates the type of mind. Mercury, his servant, stands for the intellect. Neptune suggests the emotions, aspirations, cravings, and yearnings. Mars, the energy, courage, and active passions. Venus, the appreciative affections and desire for completion or balance. The Sun, the glory, renown, success, or standing among one's fellow men. The Moon, the heredity, habits, methods, style, memory, and imagination. Pagan's individual ascendant sign readings are keyword-based but almost exclusively related to character, unlike the equivalent readings in traditional astrological textbooks, which typically link the ascendant signs primarily to physical appearance. Each rising sign is here given separate readings for its perfected stage and primitive stage, and separate lists of virtues and failings. Clearly, Pagan was a realistic observer of human nature, one who recognized that any sign rising could have both positive and more negative psychological expressions. Source 11. Paul Flombard, Preuves et bases de l'astrologie scientifique, méthode, application, conséquences psychologiques, discussions diverses, 1908. French astrologer Paul Choisnat was the foremost pioneer of statistical astrological research at the turn of the 20th century. He set out to demonstrate astrological truths using statistical experiments and had numerous books and articles published to this effect between the 1900s and 1920s. His work influenced a whole succession of later French-speaking researchers, including Karl Ernst Kraft, Léon Lasson, and Michel and Françoise Gauquelin. Early in his writing career, Chouinard wrote under the pseudonym of Paul Flambard, as exemplified in this book from 1908, which is the very first by any astrological author I have found to include mention of a word directly derived from psychology in its title, in this case psychologique. Chouinard evinces a complex relationship to modern psychology in this book, arguing initially that psychology in itself is unreliable because psychologists are deceived 3/4 of the time by the use of words to describe personality, which he characterizes as being the source of nearly all misunderstandings, page 9. Therefore, by extension, he doesn't believe that the reading of character by astrologers is likely to be any more reliable than its reading by psychologists. Si je ne crois au métier de tireur d'horoscope et en général à toute tentative de définition du caractère dans le langage humain, c'est à cause de l'insuffisance de celui-ci en psychologie, source de presque tous les malentendus. Je crois que la psychologie, comme la musique, exige un langage spécial et que ces pothétistes sont les 3/4 du temps dupes des mots. Thus, implicitly, rather than calling for an immediate alignment of astrology with psychology, Chouinard is arguing that psychology itself needs reform to eliminate the problems inherent in its use of language that can be interpreted in different ways to describe character. For Chouinard, modern psychology is no more scientific than modern astrology because they both suffer from this problem. Most of the book is then focused on scientific astrological research, but towards the end, Chouinard addresses the issue of the integration of astrology with psychology. First, he prints a long discursive letter he sent in November 1904 to a colonel in response to a question asked by that colonel on the topic of fate and free will. His response shows, page 141, that despite his reservations about modern psychology, he is a true believer in there being what he calls psychological laws of celestial correspondences, and that it will be possible to scientifically prove this fact. Des lois psychologiques de correspondance céleste existent. Quelque étonnant qu'il puisse sembler aujourd'hui, ce fait-là peut être établi avec une rigueur scientifique qu'il est impossible de nier en face de l'expérience. He goes on, pages 142 to 3, to express disagreement with modern authorities who recognize astrological influence only upon the orientation of the innate faculties, which is another way of saying individual psychology, but who are completely resistant to the idea that the celestial bodies have any ongoing impact on the course of human life. Chouinard's own studies have supported the validity of life changes being indicated by transits. Des observations répétées prouvent en effet des lois manifestes de correspondance entre certains passages d'astres et les phases d'évolution, bonnes ou mauvaises, d'une existence humaine. Cette question des transits planétaires est une source de preuves positives. Towards the end of his letter, pages 148 to 9, Chouinard expresses the view that children's education could beneficially be judiciously tailored to their variable faculties, whether those variations be astrologically or genetically conferred. He concludes that psychology is of fundamental importance and will need to serve all other sciences, although it is his view that the exposition of its laws is currently, as of 1904, at a primitive stage of development. He explicitly cites astrology as one such science it may serve, and argues that astrology is probably less different from psychology than it appears, and should be fused with psychology to place it on a more scientific footing than has hitherto been the case. Sous tous ces rapports, la psychologie paraît fondamentale, comme science devant servir à tous les autres. Nul ne sait ce que l'avenir de la science nous réserve en ce qui concerne le magnétisme astral dont ces lois psychologiques à peine ébauchées. La fusion de ces deux sources d'études, probablement plus différentes en apparence qu'en réalité, permettrait peut-être d'établir sur des bases positives une science qui fut de toutes les époques, mais que les charlatans ont été à peu près seuls à exploiter jusqu'ici. The significance of this letter to the origins of and motive factors behind the development of modern psychological astrology can hardly be overstated. Schwarzner was cogently arguing for the fusion of astrology with modern psychology in 1904, although his argument was only printed in the book 4 years later in 1908. This was still long before any of Carl Jung's works that would later influence the development of psychological astrology had been published in the original German. The historical implication is clear. Astrologers were already motivated to develop psychological astrology long before Jung even emerged to prominence. His copious later writings were ultimately a powerful tool in astrologers' quest to develop an astrology informed by modern psychology, but did not initially inspire that quest. And it is historically entirely reasonable to infer that astrologers would have developed variant forms of psychological astrology even if Jung had never published at all. The final chapter of Preuves et bases de l'astrologie scientifique is headed Essai de psychologie astrale. In this essay, Schwarzner proposes that just as there are harmonious and dissonant musical chords and astrological influences, so too are there varying degrees of harmony within human psychology itself, and that this is linked to astrological influences. He draws a distinction between innate human faculties and the latent evolutionary powers or potentialities of those same faculties, both of which categories he regards as being subject to astrological influences, and argues that the study of human psychology itself is incomplete unless it simultaneously takes into account both manifest faculties and latent powers of evolution, such as are demonstrated to exist by the study of astrology. After again criticizing modern psychology, page 166, on account of the perceived lack of clarity inherent both in its systems of classification of the human faculties and of the judgment of the character of individual subjects, Schwarzner suggests, page 167, that at least astrology instills a measure of objectivity to character judgment by tying it to known astronomical facts. On voit donc que l'astrologie permet, en certains cas du moins, de pouvoir conclure scientifiquement que tel jugement sur un caractère est plus juste que tel autre. The collective implication of these words is that the judgment of character from psychological observation alone is more error-prone than its judgment in the light of astrology. It is clear that Schwarzner's proposed fusion of astrology with psychology is aimed at benefiting not only astrology but also psychology itself. The author goes on to outline, page 168, 3 ways in which the psychology of any individual may be judged through the lens of astrology. First, by the fabric of connections woven between the different faculties, as indicated by the study of the astrological aspects linking their respective significators. Secondly, by the degree of intensity with which each faculty is individually expressed within the psychology as a whole, as indicated by the strength of the placement of its significator in the birth chart, for example, its degree of proximity to one of the angles. And thirdly, by the degree of harmony indicated of each faculty by the specific nature of the aspects its significator receives from other planets. He concludes, pages 175 to 6, by expressing his faith that the unprecedented present-day obsession of thinkers with establishing a standard for psychological judgment will lead sooner or later to the re-establishment of astrological truths. Source 12, Elizabeth Town and Catherine Struble-Tring, How to Read Character, 1909. This is an unsophisticated American sun sign primer published in Massachusetts, whose key historical significance is arguably its title, one that references only the reading of character and mentions neither astrology nor solar biology. yet the content is exclusively astrological, and there are not even any theoretical introductory chapters, just 12 short chapters, one for each of the sun signs. This suggests that by the late 1900s, it had become almost a given in American popular astrological culture that the sun signs were a key to the reading of character. Each chapter commences with the words character reading and inspiration for those born under the sign. There is some focus on suitable professions for each sun sign, but the observations are otherwise almost exclusively psychologically oriented, albeit with a somewhat judgmental tone in places. Source 13, Caro, When Were You Born? A book that will bring success, your character told, your tendencies explained, your future indicated, 1912. By 1912, the palmist Caro, whose real name was William John Warner, had become a best-selling author of books on hand reading, but he was also interested in astrology, although it was not his area of real expertise. His book, When You Were Born, is another example of a sun sign primer from this period that focuses by design on the reading of character. There is some numerology thrown in for good measure at the end, but we can disregard that for present purposes. In his preface, pages 5 to 6, Caro explains his endeavour thus. The purpose of this book is to endeavour to show in a clear and simple manner the useful and practical truth that underlies the so-called occult study of reading character and disposition by the period of birth. In the present book, I have drawn largely from my own experiences in this study of character, and I may safely state that there is not a rule I have given concerning character, tendencies, or health which has not been thoroughly verified by me in my own work. The key historical point here is that several different writers on character reading by the sun signs were all making and reporting on their own psychological observations at the very start of the 20th century. This was a form of psychological astrology, although it was an observation-based one and not one rooted in either esoteric, spiritual, or academic psychological theories. Caro's 1912 book testifies to the continuing prominence of a popular astrological subculture that was singularly focused on the reading of character from natal astrological sign placements, 25 years after the first publication of Hiram Butler's book Solar Biology that set this trend in motion, but 24 years before the appearance of Rudyard's The Astrology of Personality. Source 14, Bapt Wiedemann, Die wichtigsten Geheimnisse der Astrologie, zugleich eine Einleitung Charakter, Temperament, Neigungen, Fähigkeit, Schicksal und von sich und anderen kennen zu lernen und daraus wahr zu sagen. Mit Tabellen und Abbildungen ein Buch zur Erlangung der Selbstmenschen-Natur und Gotteserkenntnis, or something like that. Sorry, I think I might have typed that last word wrong. 1913. Gotteskenntnis. This 72-page book is printed in Gothic script and was one of two astrological books published at Leipzig by the long-established Verlag Max Spohr around this time, the other appearing in 1914. This was the very early stage in the modern revival of German astrological literature, just 9 years after Karl Brandler Pracht's first book appeared in 1905. The text gives considerable prominence to some of Helena Blavatsky's ideas and includes much esoteric astrological lore in a similar vein, but of note for our purposes is the 4th chapter, headed Natur und Einfluss der Planeten, der Sonne und des Mondes auf den Charakter und das Temperament des Menschen, meaning nature and influence of the planets, the sun and the moon on human character and temperament. The focus of a whole chapter on the luminaries and planets specific to their influence on human character and temperament is in keeping with the developing trend towards a more psychological reading of the birth chart. Although the material on temperament, which includes connections drawn between the astrological elements and the choleric, sanguine, melancholic, and phlegmatic temperaments, is much more traditional. Last source, Alan Leo, Esoteric Astrology, A Study in Human Nature, 1913. Esoteric Astrology was the last of Alan Leo's 7 major astrological textbooks. Although he had previously expanded principles for the esoteric reading of the birth chart in portions of his other books, this was his definitive statement on the topic, and is a conceptually dense and difficult book to digest, being awash with esoteric lore drawn from theosophical and mystical Indian influences, which goes beyond the purposes of this study. Leo's avowed aim with this book was to show the essence or principle behind all things, that subtle, indefinable something which is the essence and cause of all manifestation, page 13. He draws this distinction, pages 13 to 14. Esoteric astrology deals with the abstract cause, the philosophy, and the inner or more subtle point of view, whilst exoteric astrology is content with the effect, the practice, and the concrete or outer expression, preferring the more tangible and evident to the speculative and theoretical. The book is indeed more theoretical and abstract than it is practically useful to astrologers, but it does attempt to define principles in respect of the planets, the elements, the modes, and the aspects, in the light of which a coherent understanding of the inner workings of astrology may be arrived at. Within Chapter 4, Spheres of Influence, Leo does connect the luminaries and inner planets, together with Uranus, to different faculties of the inner human experience. This is about as far as the book gets in connecting astrology with psychology, however, as it is far more concerned with exploring a spiritual cosmology. Within this chapter, we find the Sun connected to cosmic consciousness, Uranus to the will of the spirit, Mercury to abstract reason, Venus to inner perception of being and to grace and refinement of thought and feeling, the Moon to the personal mind, and Mars to the personal feelings. Ultimately, rather than bringing astrology closer to modern psychology, this book by Leo belongs more to the realm of spiritual hypothesis and metaphysical speculation. In its day, it ploughed a furrow at a sharp tangent to the emerging, more observation-based astrological psychology of contemporaneous non-theosophical works, including the lineage descended from Hiram Butler's solar biology, despite Butler's own esoteric leanings. Alan Leo's esoteric astrology arguably paved the way for later spiritually focused works at the doctrinaire esoteric margins of modern astrology, such as the like-named book by Alice Bailey, rather than assisting in the development of modern psychological astrology. Such books, of course, have their adherents to this day, but modern psychology is focused much more on understanding people as they are and how they think and work, rather than interpreting facets of manifest reality according to speculative theoretical principles, making it ultimately a poor fit for esoteric astrology as expounded by either Leo or Bailey. And that is where we end the source exploration for today. So I'm going to stop sharing and return to Mary or Roy to take things further.
Thanks very much, Philip. If you've got any questions, stick them in the chat. What I am going to put into the chat again, which I think I put in earlier, but you might not see it because it's a bit early on, is how to get to the YouTube channel for this afterwards, how to get to the library itself. So I'm just going to pop that down into the chat. There we go. Boomf. So I think we had a comment earlier. Scott, do you want to bring a question in there? You've popped a few things in the chat. Where is
Nice.
Scott?
It's just nice to catch the
Yeah.
tail end of this. I'll be watching the recording. I did find a copy of Solar Biology, a decent PDF if anyone needs it. I can send it to you, Mary. And uh, I guess I have another hour and a half of the lecture to go back and watch. So
Yeah. It's a very full one, Scott. It's very full. Philip, are all these 15 books scanned, or only some of them?
Only, I
As far as
think,
the online library is concerned.
about half of them so far. We certainly have all the Alan Leo ones, and we've got we've got Butler's Solar Biology in there. We have the Zadkiel and Raphael books. I don't know of the ones after 1900. We'd have to check that. We don't have anything in other languages yet in our online library, so those will have to follow at a later date.
Charlotte, unmute.
Right. Yeah. Fascinating. I've had to read huge amounts of 20th century works for my dissertation, so I'm familiar with a little bit of what you're talking about. But what I was reading today, coincidentally, was Esotericism in Western Culture by Wouter Hanegraaff. I don't know if you know it. But it struck me that when we're talking about psychology in the 19th century, it's a far cry from what we think about as psychology, even at the end of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th. We're moving from mesmerism and somnambulism to what is it, New Thought that Butler was part of. And Colville, he was also a medium who, so originally psychology was seen of a way of studying the soul, and gradually in psychology, definitely when it got into academia, they sort of got rid of the word soul and introduced the word consciousness and ego and stuff like this. So when we're looking at these really older manuscripts, I'm sort of thinking, what did they understand as psychology? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Obviously, academic psychology developed in leaps and bounds in the early 20th century, but some of the quotations I gave, I think, show that, for instance, Butler was looking at what was motivating people inwardly, and I don't think he was even using the word soul when he was discussing that. So I think it was a lot more than just thinking about the soul in the 1880s.
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, he was part of the New Thought. So this idea that your mind can overcome pretty much anything. So I figure that's pretty much the essence of his book. But if I think about the development of psychology, I really think, that Freud, was sort of really a turning point when we really start looking at different layers within the mind.
Yeah,
And that
that's
we
that's
see
that's
that
that's
also in the later quotations you read, you start getting a sense of astrologers also looking at the different levels of mind.
definitely that's very valid, and I do think that as the 20th century wore on, astrologers were increasingly reading people like Freud and eventually Jung, and in the next installment of this, you will see more evidence of that, where, for instance, they are directly referencing famous psychologists, and not only Freud and Jung for that matter, there were others as well.
Thank you, Philip. It was brilliant.
I'm glad you enjoyed it, Charlotte. Thank you for coming to listen. And thank you, Scott, as well for your comments. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the talk when you have a chance to listen to it. More questions?
We haven't got any more questions, but Kai has said, thank you. Wonderful journey through the literary tradition and its transmission. And Carol says, fascinating talk. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you both.
Mm. Yeah.
And Anna says, excellent presentation. Thanks.
Mhm.
Thanks, Anna. I think another comment just popped up on the screen there a moment ago. Can we find that one? I
Oh, yeah,
can't
we got
see the chat.
Vanessa. They seem to discuss psychological traits as fatalistic descriptions rather than fluid motivations.
Oh, that's worth a comment.
That's an interesting observation. Well, they certainly were more primitive views of psychological traits than have been developed in the 20th century, on the later 20th century. But the key point is that astrologers collectively were moving in a psychological direction in their readings with what they knew with the psychological theory they had at that time, which wasn't yet fully developed, of course. So obviously all the depth psychology was still waiting at that time to be discovered and to be introduced. But we will come to something much closer to modern psychology. Modern psychological astrology, I think, when we explore the sources from 1914 to 1935 in the next part of this talk, it was getting a lot more in depth at that stage gradually. But it was a slow progression through
So
primitive
maybe some
psychology.
homework to get up to date, and if possible, you can go, if you're a member of the, if you've subscribed to the online library, you can access quite a few of these books there and read them thoroughly, and not just listen to the extracts that Philip's read out to us, and prepare for the next section, which will be bringing us up to 1960. Is that right, Philip? Yeah. Mm.
Sorry, well, the next one will take us from 1914 to 1935, and there'll be 20 sources because when I originally prepared for this talk, I had too much material to come to fit into one talk, so we split it. It was originally going to take us all the way to the dawn of the publication of the Astrology of Personality, but it was going to be too long. And that's why we're now going to cover the sources from 1914 to 1935 in part two, which will probably be enough material for a talk almost as long, though not quite as this one. We won't have obviously more research results, so it will just be straight to the sources next time. And there is a lot more depth in the next lot of sources, though I think of the sources we covered so far, for me, Schwaznar's one from 908 is quite outstanding because it was so forward looking.
Mm.
And have you read that?
Well,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Roy.
sorry, Scott, what did you say?
No, go ahead. I was starting out. We asked a question as usual at the same moment.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, I just saying that, is there a third section to this as well, up to 60, or is it just two parts, Philip?
There are
That
two
was.
parts that I've already written and prepared, so the second part's ready to go as soon as we can
Mm,
schedule it. The third part I haven't even started working on yet, but because the literature review includes sources as far as 1960, it's going to be quite straightforward for me to systematically work through those one at a time, as I did preparing for the first two parts, and see what I can find in them and basically write up the salient points and make another talk. In fact, I mean, depending on how in depth we go with the sources from 1936 1960, there may be enough for two more parts in the future between those years.
So it's a question from
uh,
Hilary. She
yeah.
apologizes if you've already addressed this, but she was wondering about the word archetype as used by Jung and scholars in his school of thought, like Joseph Campbell. She says she's new to astrological reading and she's struck with how many times the words and concepts are used. Did this come up in astrology before Jung as it was moving towards what we think of as psychology as starting to develop in the early 20th century? Maybe a question for another time.
Yes, that will perhaps be best. I'll be better placed to answer that after we complete the next talk. I certainly don't recall archetype coming up in any of the quotations we had today, and nor do I recall seeing it in any of the early sources. It may be one of those bits of the language of modern psychology that came in more slightly later in the early 20th century and therefore took a while to filter through to astrology books that had a psychological focus. But that's a very good question again.
Great. I've got another one just come in
Yeah,
for
I wonder,
Scott.
and this is
Scott his
Scott,
question
yeah.
down. Yeah.
I wonder if anyone's done comparative studies of different translations of the same astrological books into English. For instance, there's now a new excellent translation of L'Astrologie Greek.
correct. Yeah.
Correct.
Well,
Sorry, wrong pronunciation.
I mean, Astrology Grec was by Auguste Boucher-Leclerc. For those who don't know it, it's for its time, it was fairly detailed study of ancient Greek astrology, and it was first published in 1899. However, Auguste Boucher-Leclerc himself was relying on the limited uncovering of Hellenistic and earlier ancient texts, and also later ancient texts, that were available to scholars in the 1890s. Now, if you think that the Tubner series of critical editions of the ancient Greek source text started very, very slowly in around 1860 with Manetho's poem, and by 1898, very few of those had even been published, the Greek editions. So I think Boucher-Leclerc's book was a useful book of its time, but it's been superseded by scholarship since. So even though translations into English are interesting, it's the scholarship itself is so out of date now that I kind of question what the usefulness would be of having multiple translations. I know that Less Than Less privately made a translation of Astrology Greek, which he was intending to publish because he used to talk about it in the 2000s. I don't think his translation was ever
I
published.
don't think it was either. I think the interesting thing is to dem would be, I mean, it would be a great article in journal that you and I and about 30 other people would enjoy. Just seeing that the era, like how would a 1920 translation of Astrology Grec compare to, a 2010? I mean,
Yeah,
if there are enough translations of the same books, and I'm not talking about Ptolemy here, right? I'm talking about, like 19th century and 18th century books. I just thought it would be fascinating to see how how the times affected the translations. That's all. The zeitgeist, yeah.
that's a good question. Well, we can take another example. We can look at different translations of Jean-Baptiste Morin de Villefranche's Astrologia Gallica,
Yeah.
and obviously, and that started to be translated into French because he was French, so French astrologers were interested in his work. People like Henri Selva, his real name was Arvles. He spelt his name backwards for his writing pseudonym, started to translate bits of Book 21. I actually have a manuscript French translation from 1902 of books 22, 23, and 24, which was never published, but it was sitting around in an antiquarian book dealer's a collection for a long time. And I thought I'd better have it because it's going to be of some interest, even though it's a translation to French. And we have translations by James Herschel Holden into English, obviously, of those books now. But it would be quite interesting to compare them. I don't think we have more than two translations, sorry, more than one translation into the same language of any book of Morin except Book 21. And even with L'Astrologie Grecque, I don't think any English translation was published of that until very recently. And I don't think anybody even worked on an English translation prior to the 21st century. So to compare translations, you need to have multiple translations. Obviously, Ptolemy, it's easier to do because we've got the translations that appeared into English of by Whalley, by Ashmond, and by James Wilson, all of which were published by 1828. And so we had three directly competing translations, but I think they were all based on the paraphrase of Proclus. And then it wasn't until we get to the 20th century that we have scholars directly translating from the original Greek and improving on the accuracy of the translation accordingly.
Thanks, Philip.
Um,
We're probably going to be running out of time in about a minute, but I've got one more comment here from Robert. It says, we astrologers have been using the language of archetypes in the planets and signs for thousands of years without ever using that exact word. Yeah.
That's a very good point. And one of the things I was trying to get across today is that astrologers, even before they had the language of modern psychology, were attempting the same kind of quest to uncover the inner workings of the mind as revealed by astrology. So it's just they didn't have the modern language to do it, but the motivation was already there. So when people like Freud and Jung started publishing, that gave astrologers an additional vocabulary by which they could add to their psychological depictions of people based on the birth chart, but it didn't initially motivate them in that direction. I think Robert's point is entirely valid.
We're going to have to tie up soon, otherwise the video is going to be so long.
It's keeping people getting going now. We're
Yeah,
getting
yeah,
lots
yeah.
of...
Well, thank you everybody for your patience. I know it's been quite a long one, so
Yeah.
But we've got some other messages down there. I won't read them out. I'll tell you why, because it's just gone 9 o'clock now, and if the
okay.
video gets too long, it's difficult for us to upload it to YouTube. But thank you very much, Philip, for your talk this evening. Thank you to Roy and Chris and to everybody who's come tonight. I've put in the chat the link to where the videos will be, and also the library itself if you'd like to join. So thank you very much for everybody for coming this evening.
Thank you, Mary.
And do go online and listen again.
Absolutely.
Hi there, Chris.
Thank you. Bye-bye.